You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can also watch this program if you're only listening on the radio. Come on over when you're in front of a computer and go over to YouTube and look at my YouTube channel where you can see the simulcast in video and join the live chat room along with this program. That's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You know, tonight I've been debating and I've been sitting here for quite a long time going through some information about the topic I'm apparently going to talk about tonight. And I almost didn't do it just because I think some of it is outdated. Some of it gets a little murky. It delves into politics too much. But let me see if I can do this. I want to talk about a political topic and try to not get political about it. And if you saw by the title of tonight's show, which I almost abandoned because this is one of those topics that's out there in the political fray, and that is talking about the comparisons that have been made between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. Now, maybe before you turn the channel, maybe that already turns you off. Just going, oh boy, I don't want to hear this stuff anymore. You know, and a lot of this was, I think, overcome a couple of years ago. But at the same time, I just saw something over the weekend which prompted me to want to say something about this. I don't know if we'll take the whole show doing this, but I do have a bunch of notes, a bunch of articles, a bunch of things I've said, things others have said, to bring up and talk about this comparison. And I'm going to tell you right away that I think any comparison between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, other than that maybe both of the men wore pants, I'm going to say is irresponsible. I don't think there is a comparison because the reason people are making that kind of comparison is on a political level. And I don't think we can do that. And I want us to have here in the chat room on the simulcast in YouTube, anything you want to think about this, you want to shout at your radio, all depends on where you are. I'm not talking to Trump supporters or Trump haters. I am talking about a phenomenon in our country that we engage in when we don't like somebody. I mean, even Obama was called Hitler by some of the people who opposed him. But nonsense. Obama was the farthest thing from Hitler. Obama also wasn't the Antichrist, by the way. And I know that was a caterwaul that has come up for decades about different leaders. Oh, he's the Antichrist. Every sitting president was the Antichrist in our lifetimes and before. So there is no comparison to be made. And by the way, on that Antichrist thing, even the biblical prophecies of an Antichrist talk about the Antichrist as being somebody who rises up out of Judaism, can name his Israelite tribe, and then there's a whole lot of other things. So nobody has fit that bill yet in the office of the president. So we'll leave it there. And Stalin didn't fit it, and Hitler didn't fit it. So we'll just leave that one alone altogether. So let's, and by the way, I only bring that up on a biblical sense, citing the biblical qualifications or attributes of the Antichrist, because it should put it to bed pretty easily, because the place where you get Antichrist says Antichrist is going to be this. So you can't go outside those boundaries. Anyway, in talking about him, the first thing I want to look at is there's something, and I hadn't called it up here yet, so let me type it in here. Godwin's Law. Have any of you heard of Godwin's Law? Now, it doesn't fit perfectly anymore to this particular argument, but I want you to see what Godwin's Law says. Now, Godwin's Law is an internet adage asserting this. And it was, by the way, it was started by Mike Godwin, who is an American attorney and an author. And he said, and as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches. That's the basic element of Godwin's Law. That is, if an online discussion requires a topic or a scope and goes on long enough, sooner or later someone will compare someone or something to Adolf Hitler or his deeds, the point at which effectively the discussion or the thread ends. That ends the argument. It's like, well, he's just Hitler. And that ends the argument. It ends any intellectual intercourse. So promulgated by the American attorney, author, Mike Godwin, in 1990 he came up with this. So we're talking a good 30 years ago. Godwin's Law originally referred specifically to Usenet newsgroup discussions. And if you're old enough, you remember what those were. I used to get on IRC or Mirc, M-I-R-C, and you'd chat, and all you saw was just chat. It was a way to interact with people in a chat setting before you had chat rooms. And it's now applied to any threaded online discussion. Internet forums, chat rooms, comment threads on social media. And Godwin stated that he introduced Godwin's Law in 1990 as an experiment in memetics. And so in 2012, Godwin's Law became an entry in the third edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's a generalization. It's saying, and you've noticed it before it became a thing, that when arguing with somebody, eventually you're a Nazi or you're Hitler comes up, and that's pretty much the end of it. And so that's the idea here, that the left, in opposing Donald Trump, very few on the right, an opposition to Donald Trump was that he is going to be like Adolf Hitler, or he is like Adolf Hitler. Meaning, and by the way, comparing Donald Trump to the 1929, 1930s Hitler is different than comparing him to the 1940, the 1941, 42 to 45 Hitler. You could say that there are comparisons between Donald Trump and Hitler in that they were both state officials. They were both attempting to do what they felt was good things for their country. Hitler very early on. And that morphed very dramatically when he turned into a megalomaniac seeking territory, living space, room to breathe, the Holocaust, and all of those things. So that's where I mockingly say, Adolf Hitler wore pants. Oh my God, Trump does too. He must be like Hitler. Well, there are many commonalities between Hitler and many heads of state, because they're all attempting to accomplish certain goals for their country. They all push nationalism for their country. They all try to make things work, and that's about as far as that comparison can go, because Hitler obviously went off on a left trail like you would not believe, especially if you studied history. And so I want to look at a couple of things here. And I think these are important to get in your mind because I saw it raised again. This weekend, I saw somebody that I like very much and that I've known for years from my Renaissance Festival days. Somebody put up a infographic. It's more than a meme because it's got more than a few words, but it shows Trump sitting at his desk in the Oval Office, looking at paper, writing something, and superimposed behind him is an image of Hitler with his hand down, guiding Donald Trump's hand in what he's writing. And the words say this on the graphic. It says, "Keep them scared, frighten them daily. Point to the minorities as the monsters, the shadows and the darkness, the root of all evil. The cowards will follow you. Their fear is greater than you think. And this was the meme that was put up, obviously drawing comparisons between the ideologies of Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. And I think it's pretty sad and it's pretty irresponsible, and I said so. And I had a couple of friends I know that came in and said so. I had people laugh at something I put. They put up the little laugh emoticons. You know, the laugh emoticon is for the coward who can't stand up for what they say, can't formulate their own thoughts, and so they just laugh at what you have to say. My response to this was, you may think that President Donald Trump is amoral, narcissistic, and racist, that he lacks empathy, intellectual curiosity, that he disregards facts and truth, that his tweets are a form of verbal flatulence, and that he treats the Oval Office as a vehicle for self-aggrandizement. If that's your view, understand that others see Trump as plain-spoken, if occasionally crude, a patriot, a wealthy champion of downtrodden middle class, an outsider tilting against Washington's long-standing protocols, and a man whose indiscretions are less important than his promotion of conservative American first values. What Trump is not is Adolf Hitler. I'm more concerned that such linkage may have the unintended yet unfortunate effect, particularly for those less informed about the Holocaust, of reducing Hitler to a level of mere political figure who could be voted out of office in the next election. The rhetoric, while popular amongst TDSers, TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, and haters, is wholly irresponsible and lacking in any sort of critical thinking. That's something I said about it. And somebody else came in and said something else, and I said, wait, Trump annexed some countries, didn't he? And I left it at that because that was one of the things Hitler started doing. And a good friend of mine who's running for political office, who's a liberal, left, came in and he said, I really respect you. And another person who said something similar to what I said, he said, so I'm surprised at your mockery and discounting. Hitler didn't start the Holocaust on day one, nor did he start by annexing countries. He started by solidifying his base power, and then he goes on to describe why he thinks that Trump doesn't have to be exactly like Hitler for there to be a problem with what's happening and for us to raise concerns. No, he doesn't. But the comparison doesn't need to be made at all. If I disagree with something Trump or any president does, I just state my case. I don't have to compare them and let the comparison slip because, there's some people who are afraid of that comparison. And so we're in a better position, one of my other friends said, than most of the other countries that have a leader that ultimately led to atrocities. For one, we aren't all at or below the poverty line. We have an amazing document that provides for checks and balances for our government. Every 2 years, we get to replace the ones who aren't doing the job and help to balance the scales again. Personally, I will say I like Trump, he says, but I like him for all the wrong reasons. I'll own that. I also think people have forgotten the fourth and the most powerful check to government overreach, the people. We had some pretty forward-thinking men who wrote the Bill of Rights. They made sure the government could not legally suppress our freedom to speak out against it. They could not suppress our ability to peaceful protest. And they made sure that should the day ever come where we needed to remove our government, we could do that both via a 2/3 majority vote by the people, but also by force if necessary. Second Amendment, by the way, folks, if you don't remember, then one of the main purposes of the Second Amendment was not to go squirrel hunting or to feed your family. It was to have an armed resistance that could resist a tyrannical government, at least the way that it was written in its day. So my friend goes on and says, do I think Trump is as bad as some of those other infamous leaders who did terrible things to their people? No. But I think our government as a whole is exhibiting many of those characteristics, and I hope that we'll remove many of them this year for people of a more moderate personality that will look beyond party lines and work together to actually make America great again. And so there you go. That's how the argument started. I saw this and I made a couple of other comments on this, but I think I can leave off on the Facebook post. So that's the kind of discussion. And every time I still see somebody who doesn't like Donald Trump as president hail to a comparison between Trump and Hitler, I bristle a little bit. Now, I think there's 5 important reasons, and there's a lot of material I have today, but there's 5 important reasons that you have to look at to understand why Donald Trump is not an Adolf Hitler. Now, again, I support Trump. I like Trump, but I'm trying to be there's going to be some things that I approach today that might sound like, for those of you who like Trump, might sound like something you don't like to hear about Trump. But we're going to approach some of those things. Let's build this case and let's talk about it. How Trump was like Adolf Hitler or how he was not like him at all. And how irresponsible it is to say that he is. And by the way, if you're listening from another country, like many of you do, I've got a lot of listeners in Europe and a lot of listeners in Australia and New Zealand, a few listeners in Africa. I'm going to tell you something, that this is pertinent to you as well, only in the sense that if you've had a perception of how Donald Trump as our president acts, maybe this will give you some insight into one of the arguments that's thrown out there. I've heard people from other parts of the world who are not American citizens that say, well, I've heard he's an awful lot like Adolf Hitler from what I see. Well, let's look at these comparisons and let's look at some of these things. So stay tuned with this, with me. Keep tracking with me here. Comparisons have daily been made between the U.S. President Donald Trump and a Nazi dictator and fascist Adolf Hitler. And while humanity is right to worry about fascism, we all need to worry about the rise of anything we see in a fascist state. We as Americans need to worry about anybody that looks like a fascist and rising again in any form. Given the tremendous sacrifices and the horrific toll of World War II, there are very important reasons that Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. And the most important reason is the United States of 2020 is not 1930s Germany. And when Donald Trump first was on his rise to power, meaning his candidacy in 2015 and 2016, and then his election, of course, at the end of 2016 and starting to and taking office in 2017, it still was not 1930s Germany. And there's some big differences in that matter. This statement seems obvious enough when you look at it, but there are fundamental differences that require investigation. Let's have a look at some of these things. Now, I've got 5 different things here that might take us to the end of this first half of this show. 1, a perceived illegitimate state pre-Hitler. So there was a perception that the state of Germany was illegitimate. The Nazi Party was able to gain prominence and popularity in the early years by contrast reference to the 1990 Treaty of Versailles. This treaty laid the war guilt of the First World War completely. Sorry, I just closed my screen and I'm reading my notes. The war guilt of the First World War was entirely at the feet of the Germans, and it imposed this new government on Germany that was considered by many to be entirely illegitimate. This government was called the Weimar Republic. Now, in sharp contrast, the U.S. population in 2017, the year Donald Trump took office, has no comparable grievance with the government in power before Trump. You might have had cults of personality, you might have not liked who was there, you might have disagreed on a politically ideological level, but there was no comparable grievance to the Weimar Republic in Germany in 1929-1930. And the government was in power before Trump. The government here that was in power before Trump, no comparison. Barring a vocal minority, many are critical of Obama, but his high approval rating upon leaving office shows that Obama's popularity, his popularly elected government, was not considered illegitimate by any way, stretch, or form. Nor was it imposed by a foreign power in the way Germans viewed Weimar in 1930. So whether you liked Obama or disliked him, our country was not in a state of the kind of disarray and illegitimacy that you had with the Weimar Republic in 1930. Now, there was a perceived humiliation. This is number 2. On a world scale, there was a perceived humiliation of Germany. The weakness of Weimar's legitimacy, coupled with the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles that put severe limitations on German production, produced an extreme resentment to the existing order after the First World War in Germany. And it was seen as a humiliating imposition by foreign powers onto the sovereignty of a once great nation. And because remember, all the world leaders were at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And the terms of the treaty remained a source of grievance in Germany. This was imposed on Germany. And the weakness of the Weimar's legitimacy, coupled with the stipulations in the Treaty of Versailles that put severe limitations on Germany, was what was going on in Germany in 1930. Trump's "Make America Great Again" may echo the idea of this internationally humiliated nation, but it hasn't actually happened. And American sovereignty has never been in question in the way German sovereignty actually was in the 1930s. Number 3, there was severe economic depression and anti-Semitism. Economic collapse was a primary mover in Germany's embrace of Nazism and fascism. Hitler's promises to make the country prosperous and successful by getting rid of those he considered the main agents of capital, the Jews, look at that notion right there, were extremely popular amongst the people of Germany and gelled with an already existing anti-Semitism that was present in Germany. Despite pockets of the country continuing to feel disproportionate effects of the 2008 recession and globalization, more generally, these are nowhere near the levels of economic deprivation that existed in 1930s Germany or the 1930s U.S. for that matter. There's no comparison between the economic states of the United States that led into the rise of Hitler and of Germany that led into the rise of Hitler, and the United States, which led to the election of Donald Trump. While some have attempted to tie Trump's comments about Muslims or immigrants to Hitler's campaign against the Jews, there's nothing comparable in an economic sense. However, much of the modern xenophobia contains echoes of Nazi anti-Semitism. That is, until you look at what Donald Trump actually said, as opposed to what a political party or a political ideology wanted people to believe he believed. Trump is not blaming Muslims. He never did. He didn't blame Mexicans for the economic crisis and therefore demanded their elimination. Whereas criticism gains adherence is on the level of security, as he claims to be able to protect the country from terror and crime. Whether one agrees with his views or not, they're not based on the ideas of an ethnic or a national group that's responsible for economic depression. And we got to leave it there for this first half, folks. Think about this stuff. We got to go out for 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. Stand by. right, folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com, where you can hear this show in its entirety on many different outlets and channels and terrestrial stations through Odyssey Radio. You can also, if you're sitting at a computer and want to join the video chat over on my YouTube, the simulcast of this program, come over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts and join the Intrepid family over there. Now, we were talking about a topic that I think maybe some of you are right in line with this conversation. You wanted to hear this, and some of you are like, oh my God, this is too close to politics. Well, it's politics, but it's also an examination of a phenomenon in our country where you can't just oppose a political leader for what he stands on. You've got to make the comparisons, in this case, to Adolf Hitler. And I'm saying that there is no comparison to be made. And we started by going through some of the 5 important reasons why Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. And we started by looking at the economic situation in Germany in 1930, when Hitler first got his power, rose to power, started his rise to power. Now, a lot of people, to be fair, that make this comparison are saying, well, we're not comparing him to the genocidal maniac Hitler, who between the late 1930s and his death in 1945 killed 6 million Jews and millions of others. Overall, 60 million people died as a result of World War II and Hitler's expansionist ideas. Excuse me. Let me take a sip of my coffee, which has grown cold since I started this show. So now we started looking at these 5 reasons as to why Hitler and Donald Trump cannot be compared. Number 1 was a perceived illegitimate state that existed in Germany pre-Hitler. Number 2 was a perceived humiliation on a worldwide scale of Germany, because all the Allies voted in the government, the Weimar government in Germany. The perceived number that was number 2, the perceived humiliation on a world level. 3, the severe economic depression and anti-Semitism that already existed in Germany. And then now number 4, let's go right into that. Number 4, a revolutionary expansion versus conservative isolation. From his early writings in his book Mein Kampf, which has only become a bestseller since the war because people want to read what he wrote about, Hitler expressed a need for Germany to expand its borders to encompass so-called Greater Germany and provide Lebensraum, or a living space, room to expand, for a race that he considered superior to all others, the Aryan German race. The Nazi Party advocated his expansion as well as a revolutionary transformation of the existing order, and they were not interested solely in a so-called stronger Germany, but in world domination. The Nazis were revolutionary and expansionist. In one of the most telling differences now, Trump is a conservative and an isolationist. Far from advocating increased by the way, despite his saying maybe we should buy Greenland. You know, I don't know if he was ever really serious about that, but he's conservative and he's a isolationist. He's far from advocating increased U.S. participation overseas and in foreign territories. The central theme of Trump's presidential campaign was more or less isolationism, even going so far as to copy the slogan of the U.S. isolationists before Pearl Harbor, America First. And while the saber rattling over nuclear weapons is unsettling, there's no evidence that Trump wants to expand the U.S. borders or conquer foreign territories. He wants to stop injustices overseas especially where the United States has some interests. He doesn't want to own those territories. So, advocates of a strengthening American power through better deals is what Donald Trump is all about. Advocacy for better deals. In fact, his incoming administration was filled with people who have an interest in keeping the system in place to better make money, not to fundamentally alter it. And what Donald Trump has done, even in the last couple of weeks, I think it was the same day Nancy Pelosi signed the impeachment articles to send up to the Senate, Donald Trump was closing one stage of the deal with China. He wants a better economic situation, a better deal for America, which he thinks we haven't had. And he's not trying to annex China or any other country to be able to do that. So, number 5 on the list, whether you agree with this or not, and I partially agree, partially disagree, Trump simply isn't as popular as Adolf Hitler was to Germany. Now, is it Trump's unpopularity is because the most vocal segment of society is that which is against him, and they're being as vocal as they possibly can? I know I have a good friend who's an author. I love his books. I love his work. I love he and his wife. And all I ever see from him anymore is day after day after day after day after day for months on end of anything that could either demonize Donald Trump as the president or point out how he is like Hitler or point out all the faults that he thinks from the left Donald Trump should have pointed out against him. And it's become so much now I've been known to post political posts. And mostly it was because Rocky and I were doing political radio. And so I threw stuff up there so we could discuss these things and see how people reacted to ideas. After a while, you start seeing this stuff, and it's like, oh my God, you are a broken record. And it's not because everything he posts is factual. It's because it's from his political point of view. And he's welcome to that. But Trump simply isn't as popular. There's a growing popularity for him. His numbers are growing. I believe he's going to win re-election. I'm not predicting it like on a psychic level or anything like that, but I'm saying I believe that he's going to win re-election, and it's going to be a lot greater than it was the first time around. So, although the Nazi Party started out kind of small, by the time of Hitler's election, his election victory, the Nazi Party enjoyed extreme popularity of the kind that's seldom been seen ever since. The country united behind Hitler. They agreed to give him unprecedented powers with little opposition, and they did next to nothing to resist his upending of the old order. His banned opposition parties, he banned opposition parties. Hitler banned opposition. And when he experienced opposition within the Nazi Party ranks or threats to his power, he had his opponents executed. Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. His approval rating is one of the lowest ever when he first took office. And despite the populism that drove his campaign, Trump as a man was very unpopular for the first 2 years. He's unpopular now. Not by everybody, but by a very vocal segment of our society. And not only this, but there's ample evidence of his unpopularity even within his own party, at least until this whole impeachment thing started, and an ongoing struggle for the leadership of that party. And this is, if you remember the election of 2016, there were at least 12 other Republican candidates that ran against Trump, and he had opposition all the way through. Look at where Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, was. It's not illegal here, or under the Donald Trump regime, to be the member of an opposite political party. And I can guarantee you that Paul Ryan didn't live in fear of his life from Donald Trump. And so those are your 5 reasons. And then people say, well, not yet. It's just a not yet thing. We see similarities in Donald Trump to the early years of Adolf Hitler. And people are constantly out there on the left that make these kinds of statements saying, well, not now. True, but it could happen. This idea that Trump will turn into Hitler and the Republican Party into Nazis is absolute, inane, unfounded hyperbole. Hitler and the Nazis were a unique phenomenon in world history that occurred due to a perfect storm of historical events, historical beliefs and ideologies, coupled with the opportunity to be able to advance them. They took over a weak and discredited state at a time of severe economic crisis, and they transformed it into a brutal, expansionist regime. So, while it's undoubtedly important to remain vigilant against the beginnings of similar movements like this, especially here in America, in a similar historical period, sober analysis and evidence points to too many differences for these 2 time periods, countries, and leaders to be compared equally. Also, Donald Trump did not grow up in an era where this was the kind of thing you did. He grew up in America. He loved his freedom too. He was a real estate mogul before he became the President of the United States. A real estate mogul doesn't want a regime like Hitler's. And you know what? Trump is not Adolf Hitler, and there's nothing like him. Now, there was also a thing out there. Did Donald Trump ever say, Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, had this profound effect on him? There was an internet meme that was going around that quoted Trump as saying he has tremendous respect for Adolf Hitler. And it's blatantly false. I even went to Snopes to look, and Snopes is very liberal. They would stand against Donald Trump any chance they had. But there is no way to document or present fact and evidence that Donald Trump ever said anything like that. He once admitted to reading Mein Kampf and being an admirer of his author. Did this ever happen? Those were the central claims in an internet meme that began making the social media rounds mid-April of last year, 2019, which purported to quote Trump's praising Hitler in a Time magazine interview published in 2002. And now you can look and you can find instances of the memes being shared on both Twitter and Facebook, very widespread, including a popular Facebook page entitled Joe P. Kennedy III for President 2020, which doesn't appear to be owned or operated by any Kennedy themselves. Now, the quote says this, and there was a meme showing half of Donald Trump's face, and it's a quote by Donald Trump saying, reading Mein Kampf in college had a profound effect on me. Very, very interesting. Of course, there were many problems in Germany at the time. They were losers. They lost. But Adolf Hitler, that is to say, I don't agree with everything he was saying at the time, of course, but I do respect him as a leader. Tremendous respect. And I suppose you could say I try to incorporate some of his teachings into everything I do to this day, in business, my daily life, and my politics. And it says that Donald Trump said this in an interview with Time magazine in 2002. Now, not only was Snopes and many other fact-finding sources unable to locate an original source for the quote, or evidence that Time magazine even interviewed Trump in 2002, but they found no discernible record of its existence before the meme first surfaced in 2019. It's the kind of statement that would have been quoted ad nauseum had in the press had Trump actually said it. No such references exist. Nor were Snopes able to find isolated incidents of Trump praising Mein Kampf or Adolf Hitler in public statements. The cadence and grammar of the passage are Trump-like, where it says, But I do respect him as a leader, tremendous respect. But all indications point to its being fabricated. That said, Trump was quoted in 1990 as saying he had been given a copy of Mein Kampf by a friend, though it turned out he was mistaken about which of Hitler's books had been given to him. In their September 1990 issue, Vanity Fair ran a lengthy, unflattering profile of Trump written by Marie Brenner. The subject of Hitler came up in a decidedly strange passage about his alleged ownership of a book containing the Nazi dictator's speeches called My New Order. And then to recap, Trump's then-wife Ivana, from whom he was separated at the time, told people he owned a book of Hitler's speeches and read from it occasionally. Trump said he was given a copy of Mein Kampf by a Jewish friend who in fact was not Jewish and said the book was My New Order. Then Trump refused to acknowledge whether he owned the book and said that if he did, he would never read it. In a subsequent television interview with Barbara Walters, Trump did acknowledge receiving a copy of My New Order, though he appeared to bristle at the implication that he admired Hitler's speeches. And Trump later called the Vanity Fair article one of the worst ever written about me, quote unquote. And in an infamous coda to the episode, Trump walked up behind Brenner at a public event, poured a glass of wine down her back, an incident both Trump and Brenner acknowledged having actually happened, and as an evidence stands, no strong case exists for the claim that Trump read or admired Hitler's Mein Kampf. Quote attributed to him, which he supposedly lauded Mein Kampf, and its author was clearly fabricated. It appears, on the other hand, that Trump did, and others, and perhaps still does, own a collection of Hitler's speeches that a friend presented to him as a gift. According to Vanity Fair, Ivana Trump told her lawyer that her husband kept the books near his bedside and occasionally read from it. Also, according to Vanity Fair, however, Trump insisted he had actually never read them, nor would he. Now, I got to tell you something. If I was given a collection of books of Hitler's speeches, I think it'd be kind of cool to have. I'd have them on my shelf. You know, but I also studied people like Genghis Khan. I have always also studied people like Stalin. So, you know, just because they were a maniacal, expansionist, genocidal leader doesn't mean that it's improper to learn from history. I've never read any of Hitler's speeches. Well, I take that back. Maybe one over the years, in part. And I was like, I don't care. I don't care to read this stuff. But having the book as reference isn't always a bad idea. So questions about what Trump did or didn't read or what he had on his nightstand, we have to stumble upon a verifiable instance of Trump expressing respect or admiration for Adolf Hitler. And what can be found and learned is that, according to some close to him, having been insinuating that Trump has an affinity for Hitler for the better part of 30 years, which in and of itself could be interesting, but not condemning. And an admiration doesn't necessarily mean a praise and a oneness with that individual's way of thinking. So there are many, many, by the way, historians out there that have said Hitler did some amazing things, good things for Germany in his early years. That does not mean that he is praised widely. So, having said that, there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of accusations about Donald Trump that just simply aren't true. And you know what? Trump isn't Hitler. Nothing he's done is Hitler-like. Break it down for a minute here, folks. Let's look at this. First, fascism, and the ideology of Nazism in particular, blamed the Jews not only for the economic collapse of Germany in the late 1920s, but also for Germany's loss in World War I. And at no point did Hitler meaningfully distinguish between German Jews and non-German Jews, or between immigrant Jews and non-immigrant Jews. In fact, for Hitler, It was the very fact that there existed German Jewish citizens at all that endangered the German nation and state. Now, by vast contrast, Trump speaks specifically about undocumented immigrants in this country. And some people even say in a racist way. I don't believe, from my observations, that he spoke about undocumented immigrants in a racist sort of way. If you have an undocumented immigrant, it doesn't matter the tone of the color of their skin. It doesn't matter where they came from. If they're undocumented in this country, and there's a problem linked to undocumented citizens, they could fit into a category, a common sense category. So Trump spoke about undocumented immigrants, but not in a racist way, but in a way substantively different than the way that Hitler spoke about Jews. Trump does not have a problem with Latinos or Latinas per se. And this contrasts starkly with Hitler's concern. The existence of Jewish people and citizens was what Hitler had a problem with. Their existence at all, not Jewish immigrants to Germany. Moreover, Trump and other Republicans evince a concern over assimilation and multiculturalism. They want immigrants who come here legally or not to assimilate to American culture. If you're going to come to America, you shouldn't be coming here to set up little community enclaves of your country that was so bad you had to leave it to come here. You assimilate to American culture. You learn the language that's spoken predominantly in America. While there's no official language here, English is the language used for commerce in the United States. You go anywhere you go, unless you get into pocket communities of immigrants, you will find that English is the language spoken here. I don't got a big stick up my rear about that. English, we speak English here, even if it's not official. If you're going to come here and live here, you ought to learn the basics of the language if you want to assimilate into this culture. And when you come here and become part of American culture, you really should assimilate to the culture. And so this is what Trump and many who are against assimilation, who are for assimilation, against multiculturalism, they want immigrants to come here, legally or not, to assimilate into American culture. You want to become an American? Be American, is the idea. That's not saying, but there's been no laws enforcing you can't do the opposite of that. We see it every day in this country. Now, this manifests itself in support for policies such as English as an official language, language about invasion, and so on. Again, in stark contrast, Hitler didn't care whether Jews were assimilated or not. All Jews, according to him, were slated for extermination, regardless of whether they embraced German culture or not. This is not happening in America, and it's certainly not happening under the Trump administration. Trump's rhetoric regarding Muslims is, admittedly, on its surface, without any examination at all or any intellectual prowess applied, might be closer to the mark for some people who oppose Trump. That said, there remains a substantial difference between Trump's underlying ideology of what some say is xenophobic and Islamophobic, and Hitler's race-based ideology. They aren't the same thing, and Hitler is not xenophobic, and he is not Islamophobic. He was trying to isolate a way to determine how to take care of the problem that is Islamic terrorism in many countries, and did not want that happening in ours. And to a large extent, the way he fixated on Muslim immigrants is an outgrowth of his broader xenophobia, is what people say. But he doesn't seem concerned with Muslims as a race of people, the way that Hitler was concerned about the Jewish race. And at this point, it's really worth noting some key differences in the explicit political programs of Trump and Hitler. In February of 1920, long before the Holocaust was underway, Hitler announced the 25-point program. This included such points as, "We demand land and territory, colonies, for the sustenance of our people, and colonization for our surplus population." That's the creation of a greater Germany, quote unquote. And only a member of the race can be a citizen. A member of the race can only be one who is of German blood, without consideration of creed. Consequently, no Jew can be a member of the race. That was all quote unquote. The program also called for the expulsion of all Jews from the media or any ownership interest in it, and the establishment of a central authority with unlimited authority. By contrast, Trump's platform called for the following: a wall along the southern border of the United States to make it much more difficult for immigrants from Mexico and Central and South American countries to cross our borders unchecked. He asked for more ICE officers. He asked for nationwide E-Verify. He asked for the deportation of undocumented immigrants. The most radical points of his platform were: 1, end to birthright citizenship, and 2, preventing Muslims from entering the United States. But even so, that pales in comparison to the specifically racialized and anti-Jewish points of Hitler's platform. And Trump pushing to prevent Muslims from entering the United States wasn't ever considered to be a prolonged program. Now, if you remember, when this all came to a head in his first year in office, he put on a 30 to 90-day ban on entrance by people from not all countries, Muslims from 7 different Muslim countries that sponsored terrorism, because they needed to find a better way to vet the people that were slipping through the cracks at the border. And this ended. So it's not the same thing at all. Preventing Muslims from entering the United States was not a program that was racially based. It was based on a profile of what people were doing from those 7 different terrorist-sponsoring countries. All right? Now, I think we're darn close to being out of time. I think we are out of time. I'd like to go further because there's more information on this, but I hope you get an idea that saying Trump is like Hitler is complete and utter nonsense. It's a political game that's being played, and I think it's wholly irresponsible when it's used to play politics. I gotta go, folks. That's all the time I got. I ran us right up to the end. Thanks for being here. 23 hours from now, we'll be right back, so sit tight.